Chapter 22 of Ruth Fielding at the War Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ruth Fielding at the War Front by Alice B. Emerson. Through the German Lines. Perhaps this was the moment most trying for Ruth Fielding in all that long-to-be-remembered night, and the Frenchman realized it. Having come so far, and already having endured so much, however, the girl of the Red Mill was of no mind to break down, but the thought introduced into her brain by Major Marchand's last words was troubling her. As for roughing it in such an admirable garment as this rubber suit, Ruth was not at all distressed. She had camped out in the wilderness, ridden half-broken cow-ponies on a Wyoming ranch, and gone fishing in an open boat. It was not the mannish dress that fretted her. It was the suggestion of the long and arduous passage between the American trenches and the German trenches. What lay for her in that no-man's land of which she had heard so much? "I'm ready," she said at length, and calmly. "Am I to remove my skirts?" "Quite unnecessary, mademoiselle," replied the Major, respectfully. "See, the garment is roomy. It was made, you may be sure, for a man of some size. Your skirts will ruffle up around you and help to keep you warm. At this time of the year the swamp water is as cold as the grave." Without further question the girl stepped into the rubber suit. Sergeant Tremp helped to draw it up to her armpits, and then buckled it over her shoulders. He showed her, too, how to pull in the belt. She immediately felt that she would be dry and warm in the suit, and although the boots seemed loaded, she could walk quite well in them. Major Marchand gave her a pair of warm gloves, which she drew on, after tucking her hair up under her helmet all around. The Major thrust 2 automatic pistols into his belt, but he gave her a small electric torch to carry, warning her not to use it. "Then why give it to me?" she asked. "Ah, mademoiselle, we might need it. Now, allons." Tremp slid the plank back, and they filed out into the trench after he had looked both ways to make sure that the coast was clear. Ruth wondered what would happen to them if they were caught by an American patrol. Perhaps be apprehended for the spies they were, only the Americans would think them spying for the Huns. The Major's hands were full. Before the candle had been put out, Ruth had seen him pick up 2 gas masks, and he carried these as they stumbled along the duckboards toward the next cross trench. "Halt!" A sibilant whisper. Sergeant Tremp muttered something in reply. The trio turned the corner, and immediately it seemed they were at the back of the firing shelf, where, every so far apart, the figures of riflemen stood waiting for any possible German attack. The men in the trenches at night are ever on alert. Nobody molested the girl and her companions. Indeed, it was too dark to see much in the trenches, but the sergeant seemed to know his way about perfectly. Little wonder in that. The French had dug these trenches, and Sergeant Tremp knew them as he did the paths and the environs of his native village. At a dark corner he clucked with his tongue and brought them to a halt. "This is it, Major," he whispered, after peering about. "Good," ejaculated the officer softly. "Let me step ahead, mademoiselle. Cling to my belt behind. Try to walk in my footsteps." "Yes," she breathed. Tremp seemed to melt in the darkness. Major Marchand turned at an abrupt angle, and Ruth followed him as he had desired. She knew they were passing through a very narrow passage. The earth was scraped from the walls by their elbows and rattled down upon their feet. The passage rose slightly. The bottom of the trench they had just left, the very front line, was all of 30 feet in depth at this point. This narrow tunnel was thrust out into no man's land and led to a listening post. At least so she supposed, and she was not mistaken, nor was she mistaken in her supposition that Tremp was no longer with them. He was not prepared to cross the Savoy morass. A breath of sweeter air blew upon Ruth's cheek. "Down," whispered the Major. They almost crawled the final few yards. There was a quick word spoken ahead, and the clatter of arms. Major Marchand shrilled a whisper in reply. "Come, my boy," he said aloud, turning to Ruth. "We must step out lively. It is nearing 10 o'clock." "So you take a friend tonight, do you, Major?" asked a good American voice, that of the officer in command of the listening post. "Aye," was the reply. "A boy to help me bring home the fish I may catch." There was a little laugh. Ruth felt herself in a tremor. She knew instinctively that it would never do for her sex to be discovered. She was not discovered, however. They stood upon the surface. Major Marchand took her hand and led her quietly away. The earth about them looked gray, but the blackness of night wrapped them around. There was not a light to be seen. She realized more by the sense of locality she possessed than by aught else that they were on the lowland far below the ridge through which they had first tunneled after Sergeant Tremp had joined them. Her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness as they stumbled on. Below them and ahead, she occasionally caught the glint of water. It was a pool of considerable size. She believed it must be the small lake Major Marchand had spoken of. Suddenly Ruth seized her companion's arm. "There," she whispered. "What is it?" he asked in the same low tone. "There are men. See them." "No, no, mademoiselle," he told her with a small chuckle. "There are no men standing so boldly there. They are posts to which our barbed wire entanglements are fixed." "Oh," she breathed with relief. "Be not alarmed." He seized her shoulder as he spoke, and so great was his sudden pressure on it that he carried her with him to the ground. A shower of flare rockets had erupted from the German trenches. They sailed up over no man's land and burst, flooding acres of the rough ground with a white glare. The Major and Ruth lay flat upon the ground, and the girl knew enough not to move, nor did she cry out. For 5 minutes the eruption lasted. Then all died down, and there was no reply from the American side. Major Marchand chuckled. "That was most unexpected, was it not, mademoiselle? But have no fear. The first patrol has already been across here to the German wire entanglements tonight, and found nothing stirring. It is not yet that we shall run into Germans." They arose, and the Major led straight on again, slowly descending the easy slope of the hillside. Finally they reached a gaping hole. Ruth knew it must have been made by a shell. It was 30 feet or more across. When they descended into it, she found it to be fully 20 feet deep. "Now you may show a flash of your light, mademoiselle," the Frenchman advised her. "Thank you. Remove that casque you wear. These would attract much attention upon the German side. Here is a German helmet to take the place of the other. I cached them on a former trip. So, now over this way, on hands and knees, mademoiselle." She followed him, obeying his word. So they crept out of the marmot hole and up under the entanglement of wire. It was plain that this path had been used before. Once clear of the barrier, they descended the last few steps to the shore of the lake. There was thick shrubbery here, but Major Marchand led through this to a narrow beach. "Can it not be crossed by boat?" she whispered. "This water can be seen from watchers of both armies. Its least disturbance, even that occasioned by a swimmer, would draw volleys of shots from Americans and Germans alike. Now we follow along this narrow beach. Step in my track, if possible, Mademoiselle Fielding, and keep within touch of me." They walked unsteadily. Soon the track became soft and sticky. She sank ankle-deep in mire. Then gradually the morass grew deeper, and she was in mud and water up to her knees. Later she was plodding half-leg deep, panting deeply. The Frenchman wished to get to a certain place before they halted. The girl was almost exhausted when the Major leaped out upon a log and offered her his hand. "Come up here, mademoiselle," he whispered. "We shall be dry here, and we can rest." She could not speak, but her breathing soon grew calmer. Major Marchand said, suddenly speaking in German, "Forget your French, Fraulein, from this point on. The German tongue only for us." "Oh, are we near?" she asked, obeying him. "Yes. Can you go on again?" "At once," she declared with confidence. They walked to the end of the long log. Stepping down, she found that the quagmire was not so deep, but for some minutes they continued to plow through it, but walking as softly as possible. Ahead there was a flash of light. Ruth thought it might be another flare and prepared to drop down in the mud, but it was merely an electric torch. There were voices, rougher voices than those to which Ruth had been used. She caught German words. Major Marchand drew her behind the huge trunk of a tree. There splashed past the mud a file of bulky figures. When they had gone, her companion whispered to the girl, "Fraulein, it is a patrol. We're in good season. Soon we shall be there." She was soon able to walk beside him on higher ground. She saved her breath for continued exertion. They came to a wire entanglement somewhat similar to that on the American side of the morass, but here a narrow path had been opened for the patrol. "Halt! Who goes there?" croaked the sentinel. "Eine Freude." The major gave the reply in a guttural tone. He stepped forward and whispered to the sentinel. Evidently he had the password of the Germans, as he had that of the Americans. Ruth followed on through the wires. They crossed a narrow field and were again challenged. Here a sergeant was brought to confer with the disguised Frenchman, but it was all right. He and his companion were passed, and they were led on by the sergeant. They went over several bridges which spanned the front trenches, and then their escort left them. Major Marchand seized Ruth's hand and held it for a moment. "Rejoice, Fraulein," he whispered. "We are through the lines." End of chapter 22.